Yeah, just send me the link so I can change. You copy and pasted it, or you copied it and then you have to pick like. Yeah, yeah.
Well, it's ACM URL though.
No, it's like a museum.
Oh.
I think you need to connect it. Yeah, just like send quickly. Just like send it to the board.
I'll join on your computer.
No,
No?
she's gonna do it.
Okay.
She's gonna send out the announcement again.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah. We got a new Zoom link.
Oh, okay.
I don't know why. Yeah. Like that was when his screen switched.
Yes.
Yeah, that's when it's not.
Maybe it does not do that.
Okay, so I hope you guys had enough time to discuss. Anyone want to answer for scenario A, what request they think it is? Yes, it is a get operation because you're retrieving the information about the book. So what is the request header for scenario B? Anyone wanna guess or? Yes, it would be put because you're updating the address. And what would be the header for scenario C? Yes, it would be delete. And then for scenario D, yes, it would be a post operation because you're trying to add new information to your online store catalog in this example. So these are some HTTP responses that I was talking about previously. So after your client sends this request, your server with any data, if needed, will also send back a status code. For example, there's a OK status code with 200, there's 404, there's 500, and there's like a lot of different status codes that can be sent back. There's a extra link on the slides if you guys want to learn more about it. So now we'll be going into another quick activity. So if you guys want to see HTTP requests in action, you can go to our website at hack.acmucsd.com and do an inspect or open Chrome DevTools. And after you jump to the network tab and refresh the page, you can see some of these requests and their respective status codes next to it. So hope you guys are having fun looking at the network request. I have it open on the screen right now. And for example, in the network, you can see a lot of status 304s. And this would mean that the resource is unchanged. So for example, you would last access hack.ucsd, hack.acmucsd.com, and it would be temporarily stored in a cache. So when you revisit the website, the resource is still there. And you can also see many JPEG or PNG images that were fetched from our database to display on the website. So moving on, in previous workshops, we built the front end of our website. And that displays the design, the different components or user interactable items. And in this workshop, we'll be starting to head towards the back end of our application. So more about the web application architecture. So a client, your computer or browser would send a HTTP request to a server, and then the server would then get a database query, and then the database getting that query would send back the query data back to the server, and with a status code response that I mentioned before, it would be displayed on your client with any data requested. And now we will be going into APIs and Express to start implementing the backend of your application.
Okay, guys, so if you ever use an app like the weather app where you see your live data about the current weather in some location, or maybe like Spotify looking at the top 10 artists of like the top 10 current artists, we're all pulling data from some sort of like website server. And we do these through APIs, which are kind of like the software engineers' bread and butter. They stand for application programming interface, and they're how two different like components of software are able to interact with each other. In our case, it's going to be our front end interacting with our back end. So we can compare this to an analogy with a waiter. We can think of the customer making an order to the kitchen, but the customer doesn't actually go to the kitchen himself. He uses the waiter to process the order and bring it over to the kitchen, and then the kitchen will make it. The waiter will bring it back to the customers. That's kind of how the API works when the client makes a request through an API and sends it to the backend server. Yeah. So for this, in our project, we're going to be using the Express library, and it's a Node.js framework, which is going to be on our backend, and it makes us the process of building APIs and web applications really, really easy. Let's take a look at this sample code. It's only 3 lines long, but this is how we set up a very basic Express server. The first line will require the Express library from our downloads. So whenever you do like npm install and get those necessary dependencies, this is where we're going to be assigning that library into this variable Express. And then we're going to call the Express function through that, and that'll start up our server. And then we're going to listen to it on port 5000. So if you remember from the front end workshop last week, we created our React app and it was on localhost 3000. It's going to be very similar here. It's going to be localhost I believe this week we're going to make it 50-50. So that's just another way, like another local host that we're going to need to run simultaneously in addition to our React application. And then whenever we make requests, how do we actually perform the logic that we want in that request? And that's where middleware functions come in. Middleware functions are special functions that have access to the incoming request and the outgoing response for any kind of like CRUD operation, like a get, read, or get, post, put, etc. They also have the unique property where a middleware function can pass on its logic to the next middleware function, and they can sort of be chained a long way. So for example, if you have some sort of like social media app and a user wants to log in, we could have a middleware function to detect unusual activity, maybe like a suspicious IP, some sort of like anti-security that would boot out like bad users. And then it could chain it to another middleware function where we would see if the username and password match up. And if so, we can log the user in. Otherwise, we can terminate the request early with some sort of error code. This is why middleware functions are so useful. And then, yeah, so we're going to be using middleware functions, and you can actually see them in action in our controllers folder. Controller is just a special type of middleware function where like we assign some sort of function to a route, which we'll get into later. But every time we hit that route, that specific function will be triggered. Yeah, so for API routes, if you remember, we had like a localhost 3000 for our React app, but here we're going to have a lot of different routes on our backend. So localhost 5000 with the little slash after, and that will specify a route. So the route doesn't mean anything unless you actually write a middleware function to correspond to that route. So one way we could like write a GET request to log every single trip we're going on would be to make the route /API/trips console.log every single trip we have in our database, for example. We're going to be setting these up later in part 4. And then in Express, we have a routes folder, and then there's 2 routes that are automatically done for you. But to make a GET request in Express, we'll just do router.get the path. So for example, /trips or /log all trips, for example, and then a callback function. So you could write a function and assign it to a variable like we did in the arrow function section and put it in as a parameter. Or you could just write the function inside that router.get itself. It would have to be an arrow function where 2 parameters are passed in, the request and the response. In convention, we do REQ for request and RES for result. And then we can do things with either one of them depending on what the function calls for. So here's a very simple GET request code. We've actually put this inside the starter code for you. Since we don't have a database, we're just going to pretend like our database gave us back this trip. It's a trip to Paris, start date, never coming back, so no end date. And our journal entry is we had a great time visiting there. So then, as you can see, we have a function that we passed in. That's a middleware function where it takes in the request and the response. We don't actually do anything with the request because we're simulating a database call. But for the response, we're going to give it the property .status 200. If you recall from before, 200 is the success code. That means that everything went smoothly. And then we're going to turn it into JSON. JSON is a text format where we can parse data. It looks very similar to the object properties in JavaScript with all those curly braces. This is a type of like data parsing that is recognized by, it's easy to read by humans and machines alike. So it's very useful. And you'll be seeing it a lot in like JavaScript. And then we'll go into a little more about, because we have the res.status. We have a few more important properties from these request and response objects. So request.params is going to be a parameter you put in the URL. So if you want to make a query for maybe API/name, we can actually pass in a name inside the URL through the question mark. And we're going to be seeing that later. For the query string parameters, these are parameters that we have that give them a key value. And then we can see like in Postman, for example, we would give a trip name, trip to Paris as the value. The body is a data request that we put in JSON. And then we can actually send it through, and when it comes into the middleware, we can, parse it and do whatever we want with it. And res.json will take whatever response we have and turn it into JSON format. If you recall from before, we actually put a dot status 200 in front of it to indicate that it was a successful response. Cool. So I briefly touched on this earlier, but we structured our backend in a very specific way. So we have a first file, controllers. These are the actual functions that we have in place for when we hit a route. So maybe if you want to get a trip, we would write a function to log all the trips from our server. That function would go inside our controllers. Routes are the actual specific routes that will trigger which function. So just because you wrote a function in the controllers folder, that doesn't mean we actually called it. It's just there declared. The routes map which route will trigger which function. Our config is just a bunch of properties that we used in our app. All we didn't have in the config is just which environment which port we're going to host our backend server on. The models, we don't have the models yet because we're going to be doing that for the next workshop. And then index.js, I think it might be server.js in this one, is where we actually, if you remember that starter code from earlier, we start up our server, we listen to on port, whatever port we want, and .m, this is called an environment variable, an environment file. That's where we specify which port we want. In this case, it would be something like 5,000 or 5050. Package.json is where we have all our dependencies and all the libraries that we installed. All the data is going to be stored there. Cool. So if you haven't already, let's run these commands to get up our server. And we can actually probably do this together to make sure everything goes smoothly. So we're going to boot up our terminal. Let's go in to the top menu, boot up a terminal, and let's change directory into our server. Then let's run npm install to get all of our dependencies. Don't really worry if there's any vulnerabilities. That shouldn't be too important for this kind of application. And then npm run dev will run our script that we made that will boot up the server for you. If you haven't already, I'm not sure if this is in the starter code, but go to your environment file and put in a number for port. I just did 5050. You guys can do whatever number you want besides 3000 because that's for our React application. How do you do that? Oh, Command plus, right? Can I get a thumbs up if the npm install has worked for everybody and npm run dev? Cool. So hopefully everyone has their stuff set up now. And then once you have that, let's move on to the next exercise. Let's create a get route that will accept a trip name and a query parameter. So if you guys remember from the previous slide, it's going to be rec.query. And then the code is going to be in the file controller/tripcontroller.js. We've already created like a function declaration for you. All you got to do is fill out the body. Cool. Okay. For those who want seconds, we can feel free to get some more pizza. Make sure to use a paper towel that's been supplied. Yeah, me too. Yeah,
Okay, I'm not picking that one. Oh, yeah.
All right, guys, I'm going to be going over the solutions for this exercise. Can we all quiet down for me, thanks? Cool. So here is our function. We have get trip name. And then let's do a brief rundown of how this app will actually work. So if we take a look at our routes file, our routes folder, we have a router.get/name trip controller.get trip name. This is our function. This means that whenever we hit the route/name, this function is going to get called. And what does this function do? We wanted it to log out the trip name, and the name is going to come from the request. So here's how we do it. The request is going to have a query parameter because we specified so, and we can access that through .query.name. And then we just assign that over to a variable. We just call that name. This if statement here is optional, but it's good practice. Sometimes name is going to be like a bad value. Maybe there won't be a value at all. So we can do from the JavaScript workshop, we can check if this is falsy. What that means is if the value is 0, if it's null, undefined, empty string, stuff like that. And if so, we turn a status of 400. 400 means bad request. That means the user submitted some bad form of data. And then we can pass in a message, and our message is just going to be, we need a name query parameter. Otherwise, we can do the successful status code, which is res.status.200. We can JSON it and turn it into the object with the message, we are going to whatever place. I'll give you guys like a minute to write this down if you need it. Can I get a thumbs up? I mean, I guess thumbs down if anyone's still typing. Right. Thank you. Did I underestimate you? Cool, I'm gonna move on now. Yeah, cool.
An application testing APIs, and we want to send a GET request to the path/name with parameters or request body for this exercise. And here's how we're going to do that. Let's head over to our VS Code, and first of all, you should take a look at a few things. Take a look at your environment file and see what the port number is. This will be important because this is a number that goes after your local host in the URL. Secondly, we want to go to our server.js, and in our starter code, we've mounted /API onto our router. So what that means is that every single path or URL is going to start off with /API, then whatever our path is. Maybe for this exercise, it's going to be /name. So for Postman, you should have it installed in your extensions already. It's going to be on the side with this little circle icon. And we just want to click on it and start a new HTTP request. Then we can just type in localhost 5050 and then start it off with /API, then /name. We can see here we already have a GET request selected, so we don't need to do anything. And now we need to pass in the query params per the exercise. So we want to pass in the name of the property, and here is just name. And then we want to pass in the actual value. And let's just say we're going to Paris. We can send a request after we make our terminal. And we cd into server and run npm run dev. Cool. And we can see that we have the message, we are going to Paris as the response. Great. So now let's talk a little bit about routing and middleware. So here is how you would create an API route in Express. First, you would need to import the Express library from npm, and then we want to use the router function from that library to create a router. But the actual creating an API route is just using router.get and passing in a path for the route, and then matching it to a middleware function. In this case, it would be orderController.getOrder. This is the middleware function that performs all the logic that happens when you visit this route. Here's what a sample get order would look like. It just takes in the parameters for the request and then outputs a response with a status code of 200 in JSON format. So post requests are similar in terms of syntax, but they're basically just data when you want to send over to a server to store or update. And instead of router.get, you just want to do router.post, pass in a path and a function, a callback function that will trigger when you visit this path. Here we are passing in to the path /purchase. We take purchase from the body, and then we read in for a name property. Then from that purchase, we also take in a description, and we'll probably do something with it and output it as JSON. So here's the exercise to create our post route. We just want to set up a route handler to listen for post requests. Then we want to retrieve the activity object from the object body and make sure it contains some special properties. If any of these properties are missing, we want to send an error response. Otherwise, we can return a JSON object containing all the data. So let's get started with that. In our routes folder, we go to triproutes.js, and this is how you would mount the activity onto your API routes. So we have a router.post to indicate it's a post request, /activity as the path, and activity controller dot post activity for our middleware function. A shortcut when you're on Mac is to hover over the function name, hold down Command, and click. This will take you right to the function. So here's how what we're doing. We're taking the activity property from the request body, and we're using object destructuring. So this code is completely equivalent to const activity equals rec.body.activity. These two pieces of code are completely similar. This is just a shorthand notation. Then once you have our activity, we also do the same thing to get the properties of destination, activity spot, rating, and optional property review. We check if these properties exist using truthy or falsy values. So if you add an exclamation mark, that means it will test if any of these values are falsy, which means are they undefined, are they null, empty string, 0. Values like these will trigger this if statement. And this if statement will send an error code of 400, aka bad request, and then it will send a JSON message saying invalid request. Otherwise, we will return an error code of 200 indicating success with our activity object. So let's get started with that. First, we need to change our post get request to a request right here, and take a look at the URL. So we're going to be doing localhost 550/API/activity. From the exercise, we're going to be passing in stuff from the body. So we go over here, and we want to pass it in as raw data in JSON format. We've linked the code or the actual JSON object in the Discord, and it'll look something like this. You can find it there or just copy this off. And first, let's try out a bad input. If you notice, this input has no destination property. So let's try that out. We can see status 400 bad request, which makes sense because that is exactly what we returned in our if statement. So now let's add in our destination, Paris. Let's try it out again. And we can see we have a 200 code this time. And if you go to our raw, it's really buggy for some reason, this Postman extension. We can see the entire activity object inside our response. Well, thanks for listening. I hope you.